Lear by Shakespeare is no stranger to adaptations and presentation, but all versions portray the king's descent in different ways. More specifically, the recent 2018 film by Richard Eyre is militarized and cut down to a minimum, running for only 115 minutes, which is, I believe, one of the shortest adaptations, at least for film, for King Lear. With the production time being so short, it also changes everything about the way the audience understands the characters and their development, particularly King Lear himself. Eyre's Lear modernizes the play, emphasizing nihilism as a theme, with the idea of being nothing, everything comes from nothing, as the main theme, and taking out some of the complexities of Lear's character, among others. Drawing on the essay Adapting the Text of King Lear by Joel Compton, this will compare Shakespeare's original play with Eyre's film, and focusing on how directional choices in tone, textual and thematic changes, and modernized settings reshape the audience's understandings of Lear's tragedy. In Shakespeare's original play, Lear's character is developed through numerous interactions, dialogue, and settings. The rising action begins with Cordelia refusing to profess that she loves her father most in return for the territory that he was offering to give away in return for that. Instead, she simply states, "I love your majesty, according to my bond, no less," which is Act 1, Scene 1, line 101 and 102.
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing will come of nothing. Speak again.
Unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more nor less.
Inadherence to his command enrages him, and he is taken aback that she will not obey his commands. Lear, in return, disowns Cordelia, proclaiming her a stranger to his heart. The terrible judgment on Lear's part in this rash judgment introduces the theme of blindness, one that becomes not only metaphorical to him, but literal as well with Gloucester's situation. Within William Shakespeare's play, Lear's descent into madness and the collapse of the kingdom's order, and within Lear himself and his own mind, is given ample time to run its course and develop in Shakespeare's original script. Moreover, the original play script allows for a philosophical reflection of King Lear and his emotional turmoil and how he descends throughout the play. Without proper time to develop his tragic descent, the story's ending has much less of an effect, or at least a much different effect. In the rendition by Eyre, Compton describes Lear as too far gone to process the weight of his loss, which is at page 41. This decision by Eyre changes the impact of his death drastically, reducing him to not only unable to comprehend the situation that he has caused, but unable to take any responsibility for his actions that he does in Shakespeare's original script, to an extent. In one way, this makes the story even more tragic, with his inability, even in his final moments, to truly understand the pain he caused those around him and his own kingdom. But in another way, it takes away the full effect of King Lear knowing the consequences of his pride and misjudgment, which is the main contributor to the final acts. In Shakespeare's original version, by the end of the play, Lear comes to one final moment of clarity, the final one, mainly, that shows the depth of his regret and grief, revealing his realization of the damage that he had caused to, especially his daughter Cordelia. The original version allows the emotions of the later scenes to build slowly over time throughout the multiple acts and create something that's much more impactful when compared to the 2018 film that is only 115 minutes. The original gives the audience proper time to invest in Lear, his children, the others there, like Gloucester and his sons, and the ideas of justice within the monarchy, weakness, and humanity within Lear, and his vulnerability as he ages throughout the play. These themes work together to form a cohesive story, one that encourages the interpretation of even a philosophical approach through King Lear in the characters such as Gloucester, Edgar, and more. Because Eyre reduces this development, the stories between Gloucester and his two sons, Edgar and Edmund, are not nearly as emotional, and it is hard to get invested in their actions throughout the movie. Another element, which is a character that comes on pretty decently early on, and the fool works both as comic relief with jokes, but also to act as Lear's guide as he loses his ability to be conscientious of his actions and to understand the extent to how much he's hurting others.
Off, you lendings! Come unbutton here!
Pity, Uncle! Be contented! 'Tis a naughty night to swim in!
Especially within the storm that is happening not only externally but internally in Lear's mind. The Fool is there to help guide him. He's an interesting character. He speaks in riddles that plays entirely on Lear's predicament and foolishness. Further departures from the original appear in how the film handles the text. Ira makes significant cuts and chooses to rely mainly on what can be seen as just the main points of particularly the folio, not the quarto, eliminating many of Cordelia's asides in the first act before she is disowned, and several of the Fool's lines he's reduced to a smaller character. The absence of those lines from the Fool, who disappears earlier in the film, removes one of the key figures who challenges Lear's perception of power and truth. Without the Fool in the 2018 version, the audience loses a voice of the irony and the wisdom, and Lear loses the companion who helps guide him towards self-awareness much later in play. As a result, the 2018 movie's portrayal of Lear's madness kind of lacks the slow overtime growth and build-up that is much more layered and much more shown through Shakespeare's original version with Lear's internal conflict. When Lear howls over Cordelia's body in the final scene, the moment is still upsetting and devastating as he brings in her body in the 2018 film. He drags in her body, but it feels much more rushed, lacks much more emotion than it should. Not as much prolonged suffering, or there's not nearly as much dialogue and actions throughout the play or throughout the movie. The modern setting of it in Britain further reinforces the 2018 adaptation's emphasis on power structures, institutional collapse. The character of Edmund is also played by a colored person, which could have its own racial undertones in itself. The military uniforms that he wears as well, others wear. Corporate conference rooms, like from the first scene, where he prompts his daughters to test their love for him in order to gain from him. The technology and the cities, the film's visual language, distancing the story from the supernatural elements so present in Shakespeare's version. For example, the storm scene, while it's very visually intense in the 2018 version, it lacks the symbolic force that it holds in the original script, being a reflection of Lear's own internal storms inside and the chaos that is going on underneath within his mind and his grip loosening on it as well. It lacks much of that force in there. Rather than being a turning point for Lear's transformation, it becomes more just for the visuals, more for a cinematic set piece. It's much briefer. It's very dramatic, but not especially revealing of Lear's internal change. Lear's madness in the film appears more like a psychological breakdown than a tragic awakening of and understanding of his actions. It emphasizes deterioration over time from growing old rather than a light bulb or an understanding. In making these cuts and changes, Ayer's version of King Lear becomes more fatalistic and action driven and driven by rage. There's less room for reflection and less emphasis on the complexity of his relationships with his daughters, especially Cordelia. Hopkins, which is the actor who plays Lear, as Compton argues, doesn't seem to understand or take responsibility for his actions, and Compton, in quotes, says, Hopkins as Lear is too far gone to process the weight of his loss, which is in page 41. This makes the story darker, perhaps more realistic to what might happen now, as it depicts not only his physical decay and the trauma, but it really is less of a satisfying ending to have that moment of recognition. Makes the story darker, more realistic in its depiction of the emotional trauma and then the physical decay of Lear and mentally throughout the story. It remains and it becomes almost like a hopeless, there's not as much of a satisfying ending because he does not take nearly as much responsibility for the fact of knowing that he had a large part to play in everything that happened. Now, when comparing the two versions, the original King Lear by Shakespeare's play is deeply philosophical in the way that you can interpret King Lear and his relationships. Now, when we compare the two versions, the original King Lear by Shakespeare and Richard Eyre's 2018 film version, it becomes clear how the adaptation, especially this one that is much different and cuts a lot of things, it can show how much adaptations can completely change or reshape the meaning of any piece of work. Shakespeare's play definitely gives a philosophical perspective or lens to look through on Lear, not only as a character but within his relationships as well. It gives us much more of a slow burn to what happens within the play with his character, especially with other characters as well, with the side plots between Gloucester and his children. And then it really has much more of a way to get the audience emotionally invested in the story. Lear is not just the king losing power in his kingdom, he is a father, and the relationships with his daughters are more developed. He wrestles with his own pride deeply, and ultimately, in the end, realizes his own mistakes much too late, but he does, and that has its own effect as well on the audience. That is more or less lost in the 2018 version. When watching the 2018 version, I noticed that I was not as invested in the characters. The Fool, of course, had much less lines, so it was less impactful from him because he was supposed to be more of a guide mentally for Lear, but he leaves a little earlier. He doesn't have as much as when he is there, so the comedic relief is lessened as well, which changes the impact of that. The pacing of the original and the language and the supporting characters are much more developed in Shakespeare's original play, especially the Fool and Gloucester. They all contribute to a much more layered story that has a much deeper ending. When the audience watches Lear deteriorate in the play, Shakespeare's original play, it also allows one to have a moment of insight and recognition of his own descent, and you are meant to see that and understand that. And it's what makes the original play so powerful. It's not just the tragic descent into madness of King Lear, but it's also something that can be like a moral and emotional journey for him. By contrast, Lear's film adaptation gives a Lear from the beginning who is already fueled by anger. I believe Compton describes Lear as fueled by anger, and he's already hardened, he's already volatile. And of course, the original script, Lear is as well, but it's much more layered than that, as opposed to how it appears in the movie. There's not necessarily, it doesn't seem that there's much of a deeper meaning at all. The world around him is completely militarized. It's almost like slightly colorless, and most of the emotional depth is stripped from it. Edmund's original monologue is, I believe, cut in half, which deeply takes away the main understanding of his situation and how he will follow up with that throughout the play. Of course, the tension and brutality is to an extreme, much less emotional. The themes that rise to the surface in this adaptation are more of power grabbing from the daughters and the nihilism rather than introspection and a moment of recognition and redemption for King Lear. And while that makes for a compelling modern political thriller movie, it also limits the moral ambiguity that defines Shakespeare's version of King Lear. Textually, too, Ira's version makes very sharp decisions, cutting many of the poetic elements, omitting characters' reflective asides. Cordelia has some asides in the first act that are completely omitted, which can make sense with the fact that it is a film, but it also takes away some of that understanding of her character early on. And of course, we don't see her much until later. And they could be drawn out for dramatic tension in the play, and they just are not in the film because it is so short. it does not take the time to do so. The film chooses efficiency and intensity over complexity and engage with the emotions. This might be more suited towards modern audiences rather than Shakespeare's audiences that would have been seeing this play in his time. But it is very visually engaging. The storm I talked about, but it takes away some of the meaning behind it, making it a little bit harder to emotionally invest in Lear's story. It inevitably sacrifices the play's emotional richness. And that's have their strengths. Irish film, with its tight runtime and vivid visuals, makes King Lear more accessible to a larger audience, especially nowadays, so much more modern, easier to understand, easier to digest within a short period of time, which would be difficult if you were seeing Shakespeare's original play. Can be harder to digest and truly understand, but you don't even get the opportunity in the film as it is cut much shorter. You don't get that emotional side. So while it is maybe a little bit easier to digest, it's also harder to understand the true, deeper meanings and to make any connections. The decision to set the story in a modern day regime in the 2018 version brings about relevance, and Foster's son is colored, which also can bring about a racial aspect to it, like I said. And it's relevant, especially in where political instability and authority is a larger concern, a bigger topic now. Hopkins's performance as Lear, though it's more simplistic, it's still gripping in its rawness because he is more rage-induced. And the violence and pacing and very grim, decolorized atmosphere contributes to a version of Lear that feels very urgent and very contemporary. For those seeking a deeper and emotional and philosophical experience, Shakespeare's full text is unmatched and much better, I think, for an audience that would want to be able to really engage with a text and really think deeper meanings and deeper understandings. The original Shakespeare script invites audiences to sit with the discomfort of Lear's suffering and his own inability to understand his situation and witness not only his breakdown, but his slow and just understanding inevitably at the end of his own faults and his own part to blame in his descent. It asks questions about justice, family, fate, even as he talks with Cordelia, and mortality. These aren't questions Ayer's film has time to fully explore, really, because so many things are cut and so many things are taken away. King Lear is a story that asks us to reflect on what happens with when power and pride go unchecked, when the personal is political. New Shakespeare's original allows the themes to emerge with much more depth, much more weight, while Ayer's adaptation offers a very sharp and very strong, more immediate portrayal of Lear's descent, which can be a very different experience, but also a very strong one as well. By examining both using Joel Compton's essay as a guide, you can see how adaptations not only change the way that you interpret the text, but the meaning of characters, setting, text, etc. It's transformative meaning of everything, tone, emotional impact when you're changing the way that things are acted out or interpreting them in your own way. And whether you prefer the stage and the screen, each version uses a different lens of Shakespeare's script to go to a different audience, whether that be broader, smaller. Lear's fall and perhaps our own world struggles with power, humanity, very common themes. The removal or trimming of key relationships further reduces the emotional scope of Ayer's version. One example is the relationship between Lear and the Fool. In Shakespeare's play, the Fool serves as both comic relief and a moral compass for Lear, as I said, often using the riddles and the wordplay to challenge Lear's behavior and sometimes even get him to have a moment of realization. He disappears about halfway through the original play, but his presence up to that point is pretty crucial for Lear and his character development. He holds up a mirror to Lear's decision and offers final honest criticism in a world collapsing under deceit. Ayer's film eliminates much of the fool's role and speaking lines, opting for more of a direct military advisors and dramatic silences to portray different emotions and different interpretations. Without the fool, the audience loses a critical voice of conscience and irony for Lear. That it was pretty critical for his character development, so that loss just further flattens and de-elevates Lear's emotional development and then descent into madness. Similarly, subplot involving Gloucester, Edgar, and Edmund receives not nearly as much time in the film. In Shakespeare's script, Gloucester is betrayed by his illegitimate son Edmund and eventually reconciles with his loyal son Edgar. And that serves to parallel to Lear's own tragedy and his own pride that takes away his relationship that he could have had with his daughter, specifically Cordelia. Gloucester's literal, the blinding of him by Cornwall and his wife, it mirrors or echoes Lear's metaphorical blindness and adds an emotional depth to the themes of betrayal, especially with your own children. His character arc is filled with pain, irony, and eventual redemption near the end. It's an essential counterpart to Lear's, to understanding Lear's also descent, but in Ayer's version, Gloucester's transformation is very rushed, and Edgar is reduced to a very minor role. As a result, it becomes much narrower, and it can almost feel a little rushed when you're watching it. You can tell that it's maybe a little underdeveloped because it was not given as much time. However, visually, with Ayer's adaptation, it trades the natural imagery for its very harsh, militarized aesthetic. It's got much less color, it's not very vivid. The film opens with Lear in full military regalia, flanked with bodyguards. Government officials are around. There's modernized architecture, modern weaponry, very cold, usually grayscale, cold interior spaces are everywhere, basically. Shakespeare's original script makes frequent reference to nature, the storm, the wilderness, the wheel of fortune, as symbols of inner and societal turmoil. The famous storm scene, in particular, is where Lear's madness meets the external chaos that is happening around him. In the play, this storm is metaphorical and physical, literal, symbolizing Lear's unraveling mind and the disorder of the kingdom that he is feeling. Ayer's version features a visually dramatic storm, but it lacks the emotional descent and understanding of how that relates to Lear himself internally. So the symbolic weight is reduced pretty much fully. It becomes more of a cinematic spectacle rather than an emotional turning point for Lear in his descent. The impact of these changes is evident in the audience's experience. Shakespeare's version invites contemplation over Lear's character. Its language is poetic, often meditative. Characters are allowed to pause. There's monologues, soliloquies, and they are allowed to sit there and wrestle with their own conscience. These moments create space for the audience to reflect their own moral beliefs. Lear's film, by contrast, is fast-paced. Like I said, very harsh. The emotional scenes are pretty rushed, very quick. The violence is more graphic and almost portrayed in more detail than the emotional scenes, and of course, a lot of the dialogue is clipped. The film demands attention, but it really doesn't offer much time to reflect on the characters and the situations they go through and their actions. And as Compton suggests in his essay, it's not necessarily a flaw, but it does reflect a completely different approach and a different interpretation in turn. Ayer's adaptation presents a Lear for a post-truth, authoritarian world where chaos reigns and tragedy is inevitable. When comparing the portrayals of Goneril and Regan, the difference in tone becomes even clearer. In the original plays, these sisters, they are cunning and they are cruel, but their manipulation is revealed gradually, and they wield the language, their dialogue, and social power to control Lear. Well, in the film, their characterization is more one-dimensional, much more rushed, much simpler. They're portrayed as cold and militaristic, very selfish from the get-go, leaving very little room for character development. They're just kind of portrayed one way, and then they stay that way throughout the whole thing. That's kind of the same way that Lear is, where at the beginning he's portrayed one way, very full of rage, already terrible and then just portrayed the same way throughout the whole film. And the girls' portrayal for their father, it's very predetermined, very obvious that it's going to happen, and very driven by politics, especially with their husbands. And again, the result is sharper in the film, more brutal, but it has less to do with the psychologically rich story. There's less room for interpretation into their characters. And one area where Irish adaptation succeeds well in making the story accessible to modern audiences. So he did very well in that. Shakespearean language can be very difficult to understand, especially without any exposure. But by trimming the text and simplifying certain dynamics between characters, it lowers the barriers to entry and makes it much more accessible to modern audiences. The political themes, abuses of power from Lear and Cornwall, etc., the betrayal between the children and their fathers, they all remain intact and in some ways are even more impactful in the 21st century context in the 2018 film. Iris Lear, surrounded by military technology and the political unrest, resembles leaders that we see today and in recent history who cling to power while losing touch with humanity and almost descending into madness. The relevance can be a powerful tool for helping to understand the characters, although I do believe it does take a toll on the emotional depth and bring about just a different interpretation of King Lear in the modern version rather than Shakespeare's original script, which is understandable. So what does this mean for how we experience King Lear? Shakespeare's original offers a very slow-burning tragedy filled with moral tension, inviting psychological analysis, and really focusing on the emotional weight of it all. It's a story about blindness, like I said, literal and metaphorically speaking, recognition of guilt, especially, and the possibility, however small, of redemption right near the end there. Irish adaptation, meanwhile, emphasizes the inevitability of collapse and hopelessness and the idea of nothingness, the nihilism. It strips the play down to its most fatal elements, a world where power destroys, the good fail, and the understanding just truly comes too late and is reduced to almost nothing and just barely even comes at all. Both versions are good, but they serve very different purposes. The original by Shakespeare encourages empathy and introspection and just a general understanding. It shows us a Lear who learns inevitably at the end. However, it is much more tragically what it means to be human and to make mistakes and to realize your part in that. And Ayers Lear reflects a darker sort of character, one who learns nothing is guaranteed, and understanding and insight may just never appear. Even if it is too late, you may never get it. The shift changes the nature of the tragedy itself and the understanding of their characters and who they even are. Instead of being heartbreaking, it's more of a chilling, unsettling feeling that you're left with the character of Lear in the 2018 film. In the end, the act of adaptation is not simply about trimming lines or changing the setting or making it accessible. When directors like Ayer reimagine Shakespeare's work, they are engaging in a conversation with the past, asking what still speaks to us today, themes and ideas that are still here today that we deal with every day, and what needs to be reinterpreted for our understanding. Irish film makes King Lear feel urgent and harsh and rash, political and almost bleak in his emotions, and it speaks to a time of just complete uncertainty and corruption, especially politically, and just disconnection from emotions altogether. But in doing so, unlike Shakespeare's, it also reminds us what happens when we move too quickly and when we abandon emotions for clarity or poetry, for efficiency, and for the spectacle of it all visually. And that's all.